Here it is, the anomaly. Ever since it entered the system, things have been, rather strange. I've had to rush up to the Tobias to get a look at this, so here we are. But there'll be more on that later. Nonetheless, welcome back everyone. There's been something of a hiatus recently, while the Helios and the Albion underwent their transfer to Juna. As you remember, several months ago, GMI managed to really shake HKA to our core. For weeks, our tank pilots Dern and Kelsel had been on the surface of Juna, with the initial goal of finding and destroying GMI's missile platform. Fortunately, they managed to complete that task fairly quickly, although following the initial failed attack, GMI managed to block communications to the surface, so Destry, our strategist aboard the Aegis, ended up having to send additional plans down a drop pod, entailing stealing a GMI tank and using it to take the base before capturing GMI's tank transport to make it back to orbit. Unfortunately, we don't know much about what happened next. Images from orbit revealed absolute devastation on the missile platform, so as far as we can tell, that went to plan. But afterwards, we can only assume that the two failed to catch their transport, as they never made it back to orbit. Over the next 4 days, we did however spot them heading north for roughly 55 kilometers. At the same time, a beam of what, for now, we can only assume to be warp energy, was shot out from their position and destroyed the fortress, along with everyone on board, which is terrifying and really quite tragic. Having scraped through the Battle of Juna is just horrible to think that the crew fought so hard only to meet such an end. Directly after that though, back on the surface, there was a huge explosion from where the beam had shot out. So if this is GMI we're dealing with here, then Dernard and Kelsel may have just saved the lives of everybody aboard the Aegis at the sacrifice of their own. Unfortunately, what happened next is history, the most atrocious day in the history of our company, and perhaps Kerbal kind. GMI have the KSC, dozens are dead, and although sailing under the alias of peace, GMI seem to have created quite a strict blockade around the whole of Kerbin, which not only means it's going to be harder for other companies to launch ships, it's going to be completely impossible for HKA to launch ships because not only is the KSC captured and half destroyed, it also means that coming back to Kerbin, if we come back to Kerbin, then we're going to be met with some quite considerable force. So, about that anomaly. Ever since it entered the system, things have indeed been, well, rather strange. First and foremost, you'll see these solar panels are almost glowing red. It is rather strange. Also, all the Kethane ships have disappeared without a trace. Prior to GMI's attack, they were here, working, functional. Now they've just gone. They really have vanished. I've no idea where they are. My first thought is that GMI have scrapped the vessels, taken them down from orbit, used them for spare parts. I really hope the pilots are alright. They'll obviously have been taken prisoner by GMI, and they are my Kethane crew. They're really not employed or trained to deal with that, so I do hope they're okay. The next change the anomaly made brings us back to Juna, where the Aegis, the Helios and the Albion have been holding out. I may sound silly for saying this, but I actually feel quite relieved to be back here after what happened on Kerbin. Here she is, the old warrior of the fleet. There's been some doubt and some conflict among the crew, after all these almost years that they've spent around Juna, but nonetheless, I'm sure they're glad to see her back in action. Anyway, after a little bit of testing, it's quickly been discovered that the nuclear engines we use on most our ships have actually stopped using oxidizer, meaning quite a large amount of the ship's proportion is just dead weight. There's nothing we can do with the oxidizer now. It's having a pretty bad effect on range and on thrust, and it's also a big deal when it comes to managing a fleet like this, because we'll no longer be able to exchange fuel from ships that use these nuclear engines and ships that don't, so that's going to make carriers and fighters much harder, and to be honest, the whole thing is going to be quite a hindrance, so perhaps I'll get my engineers onto that one. So, down in the belly of the ship, Gendron has suggested that for now we just dump or jettison all the oxidizer in the fleet, starting off with the Aegis. To do this, I'm going to be using Tap Fuel Balancer, which you'll have seen me use in the last episode to balance out fuel on the shuttle I was using to transport Kethane. But for this, I'm just going to use it to jettison all the oxidizer out of the Aegis, and after that I'm going to go through and do the other ships as well. It's a shame really, it should be in the stock game that you can jettison fuel, but I guess that just hasn't come to their minds yet. Jettisoning all the oxidizer out of the fuel tanks. Gotta be careful not to jettison it out of the missiles, that would be bad. They use normal engines, of course requiring oxidizer. which is why things are becoming a little bit complicated. Not to mention the fact that the Albion uses a mix of engines. It uses the skipper, which of course requires oxidizer, and the LVNs that don't. So I really have no idea what to do there. After a little bit of fiddling, I've discovered that actually, if we open up the Delta V stats, you'll see that if we just disable the skipper engine, we actually end up with more Delta V just relying on the nukes. So I think we're going to jettison the oxidizer as we did with the Aegis and then just rely completely on the nukes. Unfortunately, this basically means the skipper is now dead weight. There's nothing we can really do with it until we get back to Kerbin. Nonetheless, Tomvis is making a start with dumping the oxidizer. Obviously this journey's been quite a shock for him. He was expecting to stay here for a few months, protect the Kethane ships. That's obviously not the case. Right, just getting the last few drops of oxidizer out of the Albion now. As you can see, it's down to about 5%. And 0. There you go, the Albion is free of oxidizer, and hopefully with a little more range now. Did have to make sure not to take the fuel out of the fighters. I suppose that's one of the things that's going to make this a bit more confusing. Though for now, I think we're going to be okay. Right, next up is the Helios, with Sheptop and Toming on board. They've obviously been enjoying their rather luxurious interior in the Helios, but it's sort of bittersweet. They know that although they may have this lovely interior, the whole of Kerbin lies under threat back home. When spirits are low, their pains are somewhat alleviated by their rather amusing gravioli detector, cheerfully reminding them that gravioli levels are currently at 0.28 meters per second squared. So, with the Aegis and the Albion closely ahead of it in its orbit, it's now time for the Helios to remove its oxidizer, which is of course the final oxidizer in the fleet. This one was a bit more complicated, doesn't have a lot of Delta V anyway, but it's got quite a lot more fuel tanks than any of the other ships. And it doesn't help that these missiles use the same fuel tanks that are actually used in the belly of the ship to store the fuel. So it was quite confusing dumping it all, but eventually I did succeed, and hopefully didn't mess it up, otherwise we may find ourselves with quite a lot less range than we expected, but nonetheless, mission accomplished. The Helios now has 100 odd extra Delta Vs added to its count. Should be okay for what we plan to do. I also went ahead and blocked off fuel consumption from the missiles. This should hopefully mean that we don't end up in, well, a hazardous situation without any form of defence. Just watching the sunset over Juna's horizon as we slowly empty the rest of the fuel. These are of course the last few drops of the fleet's oxidizer, slowly drifting off into the Great Black. That's it, all done. Although, now that we have jettisoned the oxidizer, we actually have considerably less range, because if you think about it, liquid fuel hasn't become twice as efficient. We've just lost our oxidizer because we no longer need it, which, although the absence of that excess mass has given us a little bit more range, we still basically only have half the fuel capacity of what we had before, which is, well, a shame. I suppose the solution is that when we get back to Kerbin, we build ships using the Mark III liquid fuel parts, which should, theoretically, give us a lot more fuel capacity. And last, but certainly not least, of these anomaly changes, we're getting reports from sources on Kerbin that the anomaly has made quite a large change to the atmosphere. Apparently, some older models of planes are falling out of the sky like bricks, and, in the words of the scientific community, ships making re-entry are melting like butter. We should be okay for now, but when it comes time to take the KSC, we may have a little bit of extra problem solving to do. So, it's been about 260 days since GMI captured the KSC, and with it, Kerbin orbit. In that time, they've managed to take quite a big advantage of that. GMI are forcing all companies launching ships to pay them huge amounts of money in what they're calling taxes, of which, if they aren't given, they've made it clear the ships will be annihilated, with no survivors. The new GMI station guarding low Kerbin orbit has gained the name Cerberus from the press, the three-headed dog of Hades, who in Greek legends guarded the doors to the underworld, so nobody could get in or out. It was believed that initially, GMI's goal was to gain the trust of Kerbin, but since they've deployed several orbital missiles against companies on Kerbin, they haven't really helped their PR. It's also a shame to say there's already been a few small engagements in Kerbin orbit. Various HKA-aligned companies attempting to break down GMI's blockade, quite tragically, often ending in defeat. What GMI have done is frankly beyond at least a dozen international laws, so it's fair to say that Kerbin is behind us now, but not all. Some companies are, for not entirely bad reasons, choosing to align themselves with GMI, giving the company their share of supplies and combat pacts, who seem to be making some rather large profits from recent events. Actually, thinking about it, it's strange that they've captured the Kethane ships, but not the Tobias. I have, in a rather desperate final attempt, moved up to this quite bizarre eccentric orbit. Nonetheless, what with GMI possessing warp technology, I'd suppose this is more of an ego trip for whoever is fronting the occupation. Forcing HKA to watch our planet burn with our dying throes certainly sounds like the fancy of the average GMI officer to me. So, after a quick nap, daybreak has come to Juna orbit, and it's about time that Destry, the long-suffering Destry, revealed his little plans about what we're going to do to get back to Kerbin and hopefully take out the GMI blockade. And basically what that entails is going down to a lower orbit where, actually, ever since the battle for Juna, the Dreadnought's wreckage, its carcass more gruesomely, has just been waiting. And hopefully, if GMI hasn't extracted it or just plain chance, what we think might be the Dreadnought's warp drive may still be there. And that could get us back to Kerbin. Of course, during the battle, the Dreadnought's pod actually managed to warp away. We still don't know where that went or why it did that, but hopefully, with what we're doing now, we'll get to the bottom of that mystery. On the Albion, there's also been an idea brewing. Captain Cadmus, during their transfer to Juna, requested that Franklin, in the belly of the ship, work on a way for them to contact Kerbin. Now, he managed to boost the range of the Albion's local comms, and they did in fact manage to contact plenty of companies back on Kerbin. So when we do get there, hopefully we should be able to stage some sort of atmospheric attack on the KSC-2, which will give us a huge advantage on taking the KSC, because I don't know if you noticed, none of these ships here exactly have atmospheric capabilities. But more on that later. So for now, we're going to do a little plan of my own. In case you haven't noticed, the Aegis is looking rather sorry in terms of its arms. Most of it's been used in the battle for Juna. So if we're going to take back the KSC, destroy GMI's ships and its station, we're probably going to need a little bit more firepower, which is why I've searched through all the debris in Juna orbit, and I've actually found a couple we can use as torpedoes. For example, I know it's a gruesome business, but in the wreckage of the fortress there's actually one torpedo that survived and it's stuck to the side, so if we can get that and put it in the Aegis, then we'll be in luck, because we'll have one extra shot to take out GMI, and that can do a lot. There's also a bunch more stuff in Juna orbit. There's some Razor debris here, that being the fighter that the Dreadnought used in the battle for Juna. We did decapitate one of them, but the other we actually just left. I'm not sure whatever happened to it. I don't remember ever taking it out, so I assumed that GMI managed to save them somehow, but if there is a crew in there, if he's had the supplies to last this long, we may have a bit of a situation on our hands. But then again, it might be an extra fighter for the Albion, and that could definitely make a difference. There's also a Dreadnought torpedo there, which is the RTS-powered anti-fighter torpedo. Let's take that on the Aegis, that could come in handy, and that's just about it. So, it may cost us a little bit of extra fuel, but hopefully we'll have the Delta V to collect these missiles and this fighter, head back to the Dreadnought, and figure out how to use it to walk back to Kerbin, if everything goes to plan. The captains aboard the fleet, Rodlong, Cadmus and Sheptop aboard the Helios, have come to the agreement over comms that they are indeed going to use the last of their fuel to fetch these supplies from Juna orbit, and after a little more debating, they've decided that the Albion, naturally, will go up and collect the fighter, the Aegis will be making the rounds and check out the other Razor debris, and hopefully fetch that extra torpedo attached to what remains of the fortress, and finally, the Helios will be checking out the Dreadnought's anti-fighter torpedo. So, first to make the trip will be the Aegis. As I said earlier, the crew are indeed extremely happy to be flying the thing once again. It's been far too long. They've been dormant around Juna. It's a bit of a sigh of relief just to take the steering wheel once again and get her moving. So, first order of business for this ship will be the Fortress Torpedo. It's in a slightly easier orbit to get to. It's quite high up. It's quite close compared to the lower orbits where the Dreadnought rests and the other torpedoes. So, hopefully that should save us a little bit of extra fuel. We've also got a pretty good rendezvous set up there already, which should also save us a little bit. Though, the eccentricity of the wreckage's orbit is absolutely haywire compared to our own. That's going to take a bit of fuel to correct. The inclination also isn't great either. That's going to need editing. And after a very slow turn and a little bit of a warp towards the ascending node, the crew are ready to fire up the Aegis's engines for the first time in quite a while. So now our inclination is fixed, although I slightly overshot it. Perhaps the crew are in need of a bit of practice after their long hiatus. So after correcting that, it's now time to get our eccentricities on match, so we can make this rendezvous nice and quickly. We don't want to be wasting any more time here around Juna. Although in another slightly hazy moment, I overshot the manoeuvre node. I, or the crew, really do need a little bit of practice before we go back to Kerbin. This is pretty bad, and rather embarrassing. So, after making my manoeuvre node with special precaution, I decided to use the computer to walk me there. If there's one thing you can trust, then it's digits. So after quickly making the burn, and when I say quickly I do mean quickly, the loss of that oxidizer has actually improved our thrust weight ratio ever so slightly. Not that much, but enough to definitely make a noticeable difference. We have our rendezvous. After a couple of orbits, that should be a-okay. Although, I have made another stupid blunder. I've accidentally gone lower and faster than the target, instead of slower. I'm stupid. That is going to cost me later down the line. As you can see, we're already running low on Delta V. We really do have to hope that we have enough fuel to get back to the Dreadnought. Now it's time to do very much the same with the Helios. Hopefully they'll have better luck with their manoeuvres. It's already in a pretty circular orbit, and so is our target, so I'm just going retrograde burns straight away. So pretty much just bring my periaps down to an almost mech-jeb standard. I want to get this thing dead on with the target, so we can get a close encounter. If not, it'll be pretty hard to see this thing. It's really, really small, and space is so big. Although, small problemo, while the Helios may have plenty of delta V, its thrust weight ratio, its acceleration, is absolutely dreadful. I don't know if this is the anomaly messing with the design or something, but it did take me a very long time to get my periaps down to where I'd be able to catch up with the target. Although, I have done it, and now what you're seeing is a montage of me trying to rendezvous two ships at the same time. A rather ridiculous thing to try and attempt. I would not recommend you try at home. But there you go, we're now on the Aegis, and we actually have an encounter, a very, very close one, with the wreckage of the fortress, here to claim the torpedo. So now just lowering our relative velocities. As I said, a very, very close approach. This will make the logistical elements of this very easy. Although looking at it now, there is something that feels very, very wrong about coming here. Basically just to take another weapon of destruction. It's been so many days just floating here. It's not nice coming back here. But here it is, as expected, the torpedo. Just the right fit for the Aegis. And it's even got a little droid tug attached to the back of it, which is helping us get it over there. Full of electric charge, which is very, very nice. Slowly just gliding it over to the Aegis using the RCS. We're going to pop it in the weapons bay, although there is yet another small problem. You may have noticed the tug is actually on the wrong end of the missile. It's on the end I'd normally attach to the docking ports inside the bay. As I was doing this, I also remembered a small problem I consistently have with tugs is that they're designed to pull things about, and when you're doing docking like this, you really need to have full translation capabilities. And the thing is with RCS, it needs to be around the centre of mass, and when you're tugging a missile, that's just not the case. So you can't go left and right, you have to just go forwards and backwards, which doesn't give you much manoeuvrability. Which, who would have guessed, is something you kind of need when you're docking. But as you can see, I've actually managed to do it after much perseverance. The torpedo is inside the hangar, and now to get it onto the port. So I detach the missile, and then as fast as I can, I have to get that tug out of there. But what am I going to do now? Because that torpedo has no RCS, it's just floating away from the Aegis. So in an extremely improvised moment, I decided to, using a little bit of engines, a little bit of RCS, just glide the Aegis onto that torpedo, pluck it out of space. Finally just bringing it on now, and we've got it. The Aegis has captured the torpedo. So there we go. The Aegis is almost bristling with 4 torpedoes. That's half of a full set, but I'm sure that'll get us places. There's of course more torpedoes to fetch, so I'm sure we'll get them soon. Now, I've actually decided to bring this little droid along for the journey. I really do miss that old little tug we used to have on the Aegis. It got blown off in the battle for Juna. And let's be honest, company is few and far between around Juna, so it's nice to make a new friend. Although he only just does fit on the port, he's of course designed for the fortress, so it took a little bit of squeezing to get him on there, but for now it's time to leave. Now, the Helios, after a few more orbits, has managed to get a pretty close rendezvous with its target, the Dreadnought torpedo, the little anti-fighter RCS thing it used primarily in the Battle for Juna aside from its fighters. And here it is. This thing is of course so small that even from here I simply cannot see it. So Toming, the ship's navigator and engineer, has agreed to take a small EVA over to what must be a dud or missed shot, I guess. As you can see, just coming into view now, just entering the illumination of Toming's lights. This is kind of what I was expecting. It's the same thing we saw in the Battle for Juna. It does look like, though, if it could get up to speed, it would pack a punch. I mean, it did take out the Aegis's droid. Although, taking a closer look, it has no electric charge. So, we really can't do anything with it. Toming's going to have a little bit of explaining to do once he gets back inside. So, now that the Helios has done its job, it's about time that the Aegis went for its second target. Although, it really is running on fumes right now. It has almost no fuel. So if we're going to be able to get down to that lower orbit, I do not know, to be honest. As you can see, the manoeuvre node right now is giving us a prediction of about 26 meters per second of delta V. Although that does not account for circularizing the orbit, and it does not account for rendezvous with this or the Dreadnought afterwards. So we're going to be cutting it very, very fine. And after a quick warp, it's now time to make the very small, but all-important burn. As you can see, that has taken away a lot of our fuel. So much so, I don't know if we're going to have what it takes to circularize this thing. Our prediction is about 66 meters per second, and as you can see, we only have 36 left in the nuclear engines. So it's, well, we don't want to admit defeat, but that might be it for the Aegis. Unless by some miracle, we're going to have to stage some sort of rescue mission with either the Albion or the Helios. Although, in a very vain attempt, I do want to try and complete this burn, if only to make it easier for a rescue attempt. Slowly depositing the last of our fuel into the Great Black. Oh no. Hatbat, what are you doing? No. No, please. And there you go. It's actually out. That's it. We're done. But, in my moment of despair, I check the resource tab, and it reveals an absolute motherload of liquid fuel in the ship. I don't know how I missed all of this. It must be the anomaly messing with our fuel lines or something like that. I have no idea. But there's actually a huge amount of liquid fuel left. We're going to be able to complete this burn, and much, much more.
Sedenetler. Jeg vil just betvivle. Just das ist nicht so viel. Die masonry.